All right, well, this morning I wanted to share a little bit of what we've been learning at the school I go to. So I wanted to share some of the things I've been learning about the book of Daniel, and specifically Daniel chapter 2. And the book of Daniel here, it's one that gives us, it's kind of a bit of a unique book. It's there amid all the prophets. And so there's that prophecy aspect to Daniel. It's there, it provides us a glimpse into the history of Israel during the time that they were actually in captivity in Babylon. And something fascinating from the book of Ezekiel, which also is that time period. Ezekiel and Daniel go together. Ezekiel actually knew about Daniel and mentions him. And in Ezekiel, there were still some people left in Jerusalem. And those who were left in Jerusalem after the first wave of captivity came, Nebuchadnezzar came about 3 times to Jerusalem and took first the nobility away. Secondly, he took kind of that middle class away, the smiths, the carpenters. And then lastly, he came back and took everybody else away and destroyed the city. So there were 3 times that Nebuchadnezzar came through. Well, he came through the first time. And he came through the second time. And the captives who were left in Jerusalem said, oh, we must be really righteous here. Even though we're murdering our children and worshiping idols, and completely disregarding God and being complete hypocrites. Well, we must be righteous. Those stupid people led away captive, they're nothing important. God likes us because we're still here in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel, of course, told him, hey, that's not true. You guys, you need to repent because the way you're living is, desperately wicked. And actually, God had carried away some of these people captive. And the ones who were led away captive were the righteous remnant in several cases. Ezekiel was among those captives, actually, of that second carrying away. Daniel was among those captives of the first carrying away. And they were the actual godly, righteous people who he spared from destruction by taking them into captivity. And that's something that is really, that's something really fascinating to think about when you think about how God sometimes uses events that seem like a disaster to help his people. So I suspect we're all here familiar with the story of Daniel. He goes there, he refuses to eat unclean meat. He's willing to put his own life and own position on the line for a commandment in God's law that many would say would be kind of obscure. A lot of people might be tempted to compromise on what meat you would want to eat or not. Think about it, how many times do we look at God's word and are there commandments that we feel like are maybe more minor? Sometimes. Like if you were there and in captivity and you're putting everything on the line because of these little technical laws about meat, would you have maybe a little bit of a feeling of, I don't know about this. Maybe, I'll still worship God, right? I'll just let this whole meat thing slide. After all, I'm not in Israel anymore. I'm in captivity. Surely God would understand that, I can't put everything on the line just about a little thing. Maybe God will just grant me an exception to this rule. But was that Daniel's attitude? No, it wasn't. What was his attitude? I'm going to do it right. And what did that mean? Was it just doing it right because he felt like, well, I need to earn something from God or I need to fulfill the checklist? What else was involved in his doing it right? He loved God. But in doing it right, what was he walking by?
The law.
He was walking by the law. But didn't it take great faith? It took a step of faith. He had to step out in faith in terms of, God, I'm going to keep your law and commandments even though this is harmful for me, you have to help me. And so Daniel was one of those people who steps out on faith and says, I'm going to stick true to God even though it's going to have consequences. And obviously we can apply that to our own lives in terms of our jobs. You know, what if the boss asks us to do something that goes against what God's told us? And we think, well, maybe it's okay if I tell this little white lie. Maybe it's okay if I just compromise a little bit. Because after all, you know, wouldn't God give me a pass on this? Yet, what if we actually have faith in God like Daniel? That's the real lesson, I think, of Daniel chapter 1. But as we get into chapter 2 here, we're going to see this is the beginning, really, of God actually teaching King Nebuchadnezzar who he is. And that was something, as we've been going through at this time in class, that I really appreciate the instructor bringing out. And I think it's a profound point that God takes time here in Daniel to teach King Nebuchadnezzar who he is. And that's a lesson that King Nebuchadnezzar learns. And a thought I wanted to pass on to you is that Nebuchadnezzar was the king that took the temple. So do you suppose that, and it's always dangerous maybe to speak for God, but you know, here this king took God's temple. Now what does this Babylonian king think? Which gods does the Babylonian king think helped him took that temple? His own gods. Well, that's not good. That's not healthy. The God of Israel wants to make sure that King Nebuchadnezzar knows, I'm in control. So the only reason you could take my temple is because I let you. And that's what he's beginning to teach Nebuchadnezzar really here in these chapters of Daniel. So let's jump in and we'll go through the first part and then we'll look at the dream. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will tell you the interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see my decision is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream, there is only one decree for you. Or if you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can tell me that you can give me its interpretation. And the Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked any such things of a magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So Daniel, from Daniel's perspective, he's made it through that first test, right? Everything's going well, and now this new disaster seems to be coming on him. And the question Daniel has is obviously one of faith. You know, Daniel trusts in his God. He's going to believe in his God. He's going to act on faith again. But let's look here at Nebuchadnezzar a little bit. So this telling of the dream probably took place early on in Daniel's career, and some of the commentators who have looked at the dates and stuff think that this time period is actually about the time that we had King Jehoiakim reigning in Jerusalem before that second carrying away. And this would be about the time that Jehoiakim actually was burning Jeremiah's scroll. That would be about the time this is happening with Daniel in Babylon, to give you a little bit of biblical parallel there. But and this story is we're going to see it's kind of like the story of Joseph actually in Egypt. Remember, Pharaoh had this problem with the dream, and Joseph comes and he's going to tell the Pharaoh the interpretation. Joseph goes from the dungeon to second command. Daniel's about to go from being on death row to being high up, exalted, promoted in the kingdom. So there are those parallels actually between Daniel and Joseph. But right here, focusing on King Nebuchadnezzar, he has this dream, and whether he forgot it or whether he just wants to maybe make a test here of these wise men, he wants them to tell him what he dreamed and its interpretation. Now the wise men probably had some kind of standard that they would interpret dreams by. So you tell us the dream, and we've got maybe some book or something that is going to align the symbols in your dream to some kind of fulfillment. It was probably somewhat vague and a little bit mushy, but they needed you to tell them the dream so they could go back to their fancy learning, right, and run the whatever setup they had to come up with an interpretation. And they were probably making some big claims. As you can see, Nebuchadnezzar says, you agreed to speak lying and corrupt words. So perhaps they had been stating, we're wise men, we have the wisdom of the gods, blah, blah, blah. And so King Nebuchadnezzar here, he's kind of thinking, okay, guys, you say that you've got all this wisdom, and, maybe they've been claiming some connection with the gods. They're going to kind of put the brakes on with that one in a little bit. But what does he want them to do? Prove themselves. So how can they prove that they really have these abilities?
Tell him what he dreamed and give the interpretation.
Yeah. So if what he says at the end is, okay, how do I trust your interpretation? Well, it's pretty simple. You tell me what you dreamed, and if that's the case, then I'll trust the interpretation, because then I'll know that you did the impossible, so then I can believe your interpretation. And so, are the wise men real comfortable with that? No. They're like, oh, okay. And the king here, he doesn't really seem to care much about them, right? Like, I'll murder all of you, that's fine with me, I don't really care. And from their perspective, it's life or death here, this impossible thing to get promotions, riches, and honor, but the alternative is death. So, they're really in a predicament of a situation, and they basically come up with the idea that, we can't do this. This is out of protocol. Nobody's ever asked for this before. You're asking the impossible. The gods know, but it turns out we actually aren't really that connected with the gods. They're somewhere over there, so we're not really able to do much for you. Which, of course, from the king's perspective means like, so you're a bunch of imposters. That's what you're telling me here, that you actually don't have connection with the gods. You can't tell me anything, so why should I believe you? Maybe from his perspective, why do I have you around? You're not what some wise men you are. You're just telling me a bunch of nonsense you came up with. So I might as well just get rid of you. I don't need wise men anymore. They're useless to me. So unfortunately, King Nebuchadnezzar gets in his head, I'll just kill everybody in this whole class. And that tends to be a human reaction. We have a problem with one person, and then we think, well, that person belongs to whatever group of people, so we'll just get rid of the whole group of people. And then we got rid of the problem. And, there's that lack of justice there in terms of just get rid of everybody who happens to, be of that clan or that, whatever group it is, political group or ethnic group or family or group or occupation here, as we can see here. So that's what the king goes about doing. So let's look at the next section here. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the wise men of Babylon. So, put yourself in Daniel's situation here. Here comes the executioner, and what does Daniel do? He talks with him. So he goes up to the guy who's supposed to kill him, and let's talk about this, right? And if you were Arioch, you probably wouldn't be, this might not be your favorite assignment. I don't know, maybe he was a little bit superstitious here, like, ooh, I'm going slaughtering all the wise men, I don't know. Like, what are the gods going to do to me? Like, the king told me I have to stuck doing this, or otherwise my neck is on the line. But I doubt that he really was all that eager to kill everybody off, just because the king was in a violent humor, A lot of times these kings would get in a violent humor, then their rage would pass, and they'd be sorry for what they had done, So anyway, Arioch here, he's not too keen on this, and Daniel says, look. And then he goes into King Nebuchadnezzar, and what does he ask the king for? Time. Now, why might that be a bit of a dangerous request?
It's probably not easy for me to ask, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, the king didn't seem to want to give anyone time. He accused the wise men of stalling, like, you're just going to wait till the times have changed. So Daniel comes in and asks for more time. He's really taking a risky step. And what again is this a step up? This is a step of faith. Because he's having to say, well, if the God of Israel isn't real, if God doesn't help me, I'm dead. So he's putting his entire trust for his life on God and on God helping him. And that's just such an excellent example of walking by faith, living by faith. God is real. So I'm going to live my life in a way that would only make sense if God is real. That's what people who walk by faith do. You do something that makes no sense, except you know and you trust God is real and God's going to come through for you because you're doing His will.
But what alternative did he have? He had to ask for time. He had. I get the faith. I get that, but with the guard, all he can do is tell you no.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's because you ask for time and then you ask God, hey God, help me out here.
Yeah.
Either way.
He was gonna. Yeah. That was what alternative did he have? Just ask.
He was gonna die.
Yeah.
Or he was gonna die before he asked. So
yeah.
I feel like his faith was deep because he knew that asking for time.
Yeah, so he asked for time. Now, I don't know, maybe he could have tried to disappear or run away. Maybe he could have been like, well, I'll trick the king into giving me more time, and then I'm just going to use that time to get out of town.
But he hadn't left yet.
Yeah.
So,
Right. So he is in like it's a lose-lose situation seemingly.
Yeah.
But he goes, and him and his friends here, they spend great time in prayer. Because at this point in time, God is his only hope. His only hope, like you say, because the alternative is death. And, what's there to lose? Well, not only his own life, but then his own claims about God. if God is real or not. Nebuchadnezzar's like, okay, you say that, you and your God are going to be able to do something special. Well, let's see here. So Daniel and his friends, they are seeking in prayer. They're seeking mercy. They're seeking mercy from God. Then notice God answers their prayer. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand." Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation." So Daniel here, God answers prayer. And Daniel just rejoices in this. And this is a beautiful, beautiful prayer of praise. Something that that's a real way to grow your prayer life is to pray like this. To praise God. To talk to God about who he is. Something that the instructors have said along this line, and I'm so glad that someone pointed this out. Several times in the Old Testament, maybe not here exactly, several times in the Old Testament, like the prayer of Nehemiah, people will quote Scripture in prayer. And some have asked, well, why would you quote Scripture to God? He knows it already. But it's you acknowledging God's truth. And that's an important part of prayer. So it's actually okay to include Scripture, include things God has said in your prayers to God. And it's also really good to spend time praising God in prayer. Not just, I'm going to run down the prayer list and ask for a rote request. Praising God. And also, when he does answer your prayer, thanking him in this kind of way. How often do we remember to thank God? Well, Daniel does. So, Daniel here, he goes in and goes to Arioch and says, "Hey, I've got it." Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king, because Arioch here, he really would like out of this assignment, so he's making haste for this, and said to him thus, "I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation." So Arioch, kind of like Lysias, that Roman commander in the New Testament in Acts, he takes credit for this. Like, I went out, O king, and I found this guy. And of course, what's the truth? Daniel found him. That's the actual way that worked out. But, it sounds better if I tell the king that I went out and I found this guy. So the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." So, God, Daniel says, not me, God can. God can make this known. There is a God. And this is Daniel functioning as a prophet. God's made known to the king what's going to happen in the future. So we see the God of prophecy here. And we're about to, in this section of Daniel, we're about to see a prediction of world history from the days of Daniel to when Jesus comes. Think about that. Put yourself in Daniel's shoes for a minute. Imagine that you get a glimpse into the next 500 years of history, and you see what happens to America. Maybe you see a rise of some obscure country, that no one ever thought about, that suddenly comes up and dominates the world scene, and just how amazing that would be. Well, that's Daniel's position. So let's read this dream, and then let's look at the interpretation here. And so he says here, verse 28 through 30, he says in verse 29 here, before he really gets into what his dream is, he again wants to talk about God. As for you, O king, thoughts came into your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this, and he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret was not revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart. So we have to stop here and pause. Look at Daniel's humility. He doesn't take credit that I am so wise. Arioch is, taking credit. I found this guy. These magicians and soothsayers, we are the wise men. Daniel, it's all about God, not me. And that's such an important lesson for us to learn. So now he gets into the dream. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stirred before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, and which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so there was no trace that was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or beasts of the field and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And a fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet of toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it. Just as you saw the iron mixed with the ceramic clay, and as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of man. But just as they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. And really the rest of the chapter here, the last few verses, the king here, he realizes that only God could have done this. And I don't think he's actually offering incense to Daniel necessarily. I don't think Daniel would have really let it happen, burn incense to me, because he got through saying it was not me, it's God. So maybe it's more burning incense to Daniel's God, because then the next verse 47, the king says, your God is the God of gods. He's not giving up polytheism, but he's recognizing, whoa, there's some God out there, he's bigger than my idols. He must be at the top of this pantheon. And then, he exalts Daniel and all that. But let's talk a little bit about the dream, because this dream's really relevant to us today. And I don't think there's a need to get into every massive detail here. We can look at some of the main points. So we already have known that these are kingdoms, right? These metals are kingdoms. And we already get the first one identified for us, Babylon, right? Now, some of you from Bible history, we have Babylon as this head of gold, King Nebuchadnezzar, high civilization, the Hanging Gardens, one of the wonders of the world, this amazing city, Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's going to get pretty prideful about himself, about the city later on. Actually, archaeologists have found that every brick in Babylon, or at least the part this king built, had the name Nebuchadnezzar on it. So he wanted to make sure that, you knew who was the guy who was doing this. So he's that head of gold. Any guesses from Bible history what the chest and arms of silver might be. Even from the rest of the book of Daniel. What kingdom came? The Medes and Persians. So that was the next kingdom that came through after Nebuchadnezzar died. So that really was the next big empire. Maybe the arms kind of represent the duality, the Medes and the Persians there. Perhaps they do. There's also connections from this to Daniel chapter 7. When you go into Daniel 7, those beasts, there's 4 beasts, just like there's 4 metals, and they match up pretty nicely with Babylon, then with Persia, Babylon the lion, Persia the bear, and then this next one, the leopard, and this last one, this kind of unnamed dragon-like beast, probably. So the Medes and Persians, right, they're inferior, it says. And, maybe that's because, maybe they're not as highly cultured as Babylon was. Maybe that's what we're talking about. From the Babylonian perspective, I'm sure they'd have thought of those guys as inferior, possibly. Maybe they didn't have as much learning or wisdom. They were kind of, Persia was out there in the boondocks, so to speak. So, any guess then, after the Medes and the Persians, we're really getting out of Bible history at this point, in that kind of period of silence. But what's the next big kingdom on the world stage after the Medes and Persians? The Greek kingdom. The Greek kingdom of Alexander. Because Alexander the Great came in, and maybe bronze has something to do with weapons of war. But he came in and pretty brilliantly defeated the Medo-Persian Empire. He had this Greek warfare that had evolved, the phalanx. All these soldiers with shield connected to shield in this wall, of soldiers with shields and big long spears, and then soldiers behind them with shields and big long spears. And so he had this, multi-rank, deep formation that would just go to battle like a machine and take care of everyone. So later on, that's going to be identified in Daniel 7 as a leopard. Speed, quickness, boom! In a few short years, man, all of a sudden, Persia's no more and it's his empire. So then, after he dies, really his empire breaks into pieces. And, sure, maybe Seleucus Nicator gets a big portion of that, but it's really kind of in pieces. And what's the next big world empire that actually comes on the stage?
Rome.
It's Rome. It's Rome. And it says, in the days of these kings, not at the end of the Roman Empire, but in the days of these kings, contemporary with this 4th metal, comes this kingdom that shall never be destroyed. And it's this stone without hands that fills the earth. Well, what's happened to Rome? What's happened to Persia? What's happened to Alexander's empire or Babylon? Where are they? Nowhere. They're like the dust, right? They are dust. They're just, we dig them up out of the dust. They're just no more. But what's here today all over the face of the earth around the globe? The church. Christ's kingdom has triumphed. And all these other big political entities that were the relevant entities of their day, they're gone and they're no more. And so, the point of Daniel 2 here, again, we didn't get in super detail on everything, but what is the big point of Daniel chapter 2? Yeah, coming to Christ, but maybe, what's a lesson that would have been true then and also today? God is in control.
And he uses leaders still today.
Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar, he isn't the big show. God's the big show. And so, God is the one who controls everything, rules everything, and really nothing is brought to pass without him. Without him allowing this to be, without him being in charge of and control of all these world empires. And he's got one that's his kingdom. And that's the one that wins in the end. And it really ties in well with Revelation, the big point of so much of Bible prophecy. God wins, God is in control. And maybe one little detail mentioned before we close about the clay and the iron. I'm not, I would like to really study this in more detail, but the Roman Empire, when they were kind of a republic, they were real strong, and they were doing that breaking in pieces everybody and growing. And then kind of about the time they ended up with the emperors, after that, there began this period of decline, where it wasn't Rome and the Roman Republic. They were kind of mixing more with other cultures, and they were forming the empire into more of a united whole, but there was also a process of decay from within, and eventually they did really collapse. It took a long time frame, again, in the days of these kings, not at the end of these kings. So, clearly God's kingdom was growing as that clay was becoming more clay-like. So those things are contemporaneous, and it's not happening in chronological order necessarily. So that's another little detail to keep in mind. Rome obviously decayed from within and fell. But again, the point of Daniel 2 is God is in control, and so it makes sense, like Daniel, to be somebody of faith and trust. Thank you.